Mindfulness Development by Venerable Rungruan Papa Saro, Dr. Rungruan Lim Chu Patipa. The mindfulness is a special quality of mind to be aware of what happening when having a consciousness fetching a mental object within the mind processing. The Buddha utilized this special quality of mindfulness to see what was happening within the mind and the mind processing on the day of his enlightenment. What made the Buddha's practice so special on that day from the previous meditation practices was the incorporation of the mindfulness into the meditation practice. In Buddhist practice, we must have an eye to see the Dharma, the nature of mental phenomena within the mind, and in order to perform an insight observation, we must develop a mindfulness to observe what is happening inside the mind as follows.
The simplest way to investigate the Dharma is to have a mindfulness to see a particular state of mind. Let me give you some examples. When you be greedy on something, you can be aware of the greed inside your mind. And when you are not greedy on anything, you also can be aware that there is no greed inside your mind. Is that right? The same as, when you be hateful on someone, you can be aware of the hatred inside your mind. And when you are not hateful on anyone, you also can be aware that there is no hatred inside your mind. Is that right? The same as, when you be delusive on something, you can be aware of the delusion inside your mind. And when you are not delusive on anything, you also can be aware that there is no delusion inside your mind. Is that right? Even when you have any combination of the three, that is, greed, hatred, and delusion, then you also can be aware of the arising of particular states of mind inside the mind. So does when there is no any combination of the three conditions, that is, greed, hatred, and delusion, then you also can be aware that there is no any combination of them inside the mind. Is that right? This is how we have a mindfulness to check the state of mind, and then we can investigate if the teachings are beneficial or not by verifying such the results of the states of mind.
In order to learn on how to initialize a mindfulness, it is necessary to sense how a mindfulness is first. In the Sanditthakajutta, the Buddha explained that the easiest way to sense having a mindfulness is when there is an arising of rough emotional feeling with greed, hatred, or delusion. So does when walking, the breathing, we can sense that we are contacting a ground, breathing in, and breathing out. The sense of knowing the status of whether walking, making body movement, breathing in and breathing out are the ways to practice a mindfulness development. Therefore, the Buddha suggested to practice the mindfulness breathing as a fundamental way of mindfulness practice. Also, when walking, at the moment of a feet touching a ground, and being aware of the footstep, this is a mindfulness initializing as well. All in all, every body movement, no matter a major or a minor posture, it also can used in initializing a mindfulness. As a matter of fact, we can apply a mindfulness practice in every activity in living. The Buddha suggested that in order to be able to manage the mind to function properly, we need to have a mindfulness to protect the mind as follows.
Everyone should regularly maintain to have a mindfulness to protect and to safeguard the mind from any arising problem in 4 areas as follows. Having a mindfulness to safeguard the mind when encountering with the matters of sensual pleasures. Having a mindfulness to safeguard the mind when encountering with the matters of irritations. Having a mindfulness to safeguard the mind when encountering with the matters of delusion and ignorance. Having a mindfulness to safeguard the mind when encountering with the matters of desire and lust. Then by having mindfulness to protect the mind from all defilements, then the person should have a full confidence, and not being afraid of any matter.
In Buddhism, the mindfulness should be initiated and function at all times in along with the consciousness so that the mind will be aware of what is going on during the insight observations. And here in this section, we will focus particularly on the practice of mindfulness establishment. The mindfulness practice was first introduced by the Buddha. Before then no one ever taught about the mindfulness practice yet, and especially the use of mindfulness in insight observations. The whole concept of mindfulness practice is composed of two parts: the mindfulness initialization on how to activate the mindfulness, and the mindfulness development to know how to elevate the quality of mindfulness for advanced applications. The mindfulness initialization is very important because most people are not accustomed to the state of mindfulness, although there are many discussions about the mindfulness, but very little is known. In Buddhism, everything is caused by certain thing. Knowing the cause and effect of mindfulness is the way leading to the practice of mindfulness initialization. Theoretically, a mindfulness will arise at the same time when having a consciousness. Therefore, if we keep on repeating a certain body movement, such as walking and breathing, then a consciousness will arise and cease in a certain rhythm. Then we can initiate a mindfulness in accord to these activities. The Buddhism utilizes two kinds of patterned body movements in daily activities, that is, walking and breathing, to synchronize with the rhythm of consciousness. And every time when having a consciousness in those activities, then trying to sense a mindfulness. The success of the mindfulness initialization practice is not about a walking style or how to take a breath, but it is about how to sense the feeling of being aware of what is happening with consciousness. In the Buddha story, after the 3 weeks of his enlightenment, the Buddha spent 7 days on the walking up and down with mindfulness. And since then, in every morning the Buddha will perform the walking up and down with mindfulness. Also, the mindfulness breathing becomes very popular as a linkage of seamless connecting from mindfulness practice to the beginning of the practice of mindfulness meditation. In the early part of the Sutta of the Four Mindfulness Foundations, the Buddha emphasized on the practices of mindfulness breathing and the body movements with mindfulness before getting into details of an insight observation, because the mindfulness was a very important tool in performing an observation. The practice of mindfulness initialization is a foundation of the Buddhist practice, which can be described in 3 approaches as follows. 1. The walking up and down with mindfulness. Mindfulness walking. Walking is a common activity of human being. It is very common that when the foot contacts the ground, then a consciousness arises.
The interfacing of life and the world begin with 6 sense bases, that is, an external sensing object, visible object, sound, odor, taste, tangible object, and mind object from the world contacting with internal sensing bases: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, respectively. The contact activates the consciousness in each particular sensing channel, sensing signal to the mind.
The mindfulness initialization utilizes at the moment of having a consciousness, then at the moment of making a contact, sensing the awareness with mindfulness on the object of consciousness right away. And in every step of walking, then keeping on reinitiating a mindfulness at all times. The mindfulness will become instantly active. Once becoming familiar with mindfulness initiation, then we can apply to the body posture and body movements. 2. The mindfulness on body postures, static mode, and body movements. The 4 postures in the 4 mindfulness foundations.
Again, when walking, one understands. I am walking. When standing, he understands. I am standing. When sitting, he understands. I am sitting. When lying down, he understands. I am lying down, or he understands accordingly however his body is disposed. In this way he dwells contemplating the body in the body internally, externally, and both internally and externally. And he dwells independent, not clinging on anything in the world. That too is how anyone dwells contemplating the body in the body.
After being able to initialize the sense of mindfulness by walking up and down, then extending a practice to every movement of body, even when walking, running, turning the body right or left, sitting, laying down, standing, laying down, turning the face, looking up or down, moving the arm, etc. By doing so though, we can develop a skill of having a mindfulness in every moment of doing any activities in living. As a matter of fact, in everyday life, we have to move the body parts in responding to the world, so we usually make various body postures and body movements at all times. However, occasionally we are aware of what we are doing precisely. The Buddha called this kind of behavior, having a living with careless. In this context, the mindfulness is a foundation for a life development. 3. The mindfulness breathing. If we carefully observe the breathing, we can realize that a breathing is also kind of body movement. What making the breathing so interesting is that every being must take breathing at all times. The Buddha utilized the breathing as a way to practice a mindfulness by experiencing in the rhythm of breathing in and breathing out as follows. Mindfulness of breathing in the 4 mindfulness foundations.
And how does anyone dwell contemplating the body in the body? Here, gone to the forest, to the foot of a tree, or to an empty hut, sits down. Having folded his legs crosswise, straightened his body, and established mindfulness in front of him, just mindful he breathes in, mindful he breathes out. Breathing in long, he understands. I breathe in long, or breathing out long, he understands. I breathe out long. Breathing in short, he understands. I breathe in short, or breathing out short, he understands. I breathe out short. He trains thus. I will breathe in experiencing the whole body. He trains thus. I will breathe out experiencing the whole body. He trains thus. I will breathe in tranquilizing the bodily formation. He trains thus. I will breathe out tranquilizing the bodily formation. Just as a skilled lathe worker or his apprentice, when making a long turn, understands. I make a long turn. Or, when making a short turn, understands. I make a short turn. So too, breathing in long, one understands. I breathe in long. He trains thus. I will breathe out tranquilizing the bodily formation. In this way he dwells contemplating the body in the body internally, or he dwells contemplating the body in the body externally, or he dwells contemplating the body in the body both internally and externally. Or else he dwells contemplating in the body its nature of arising, or he dwells contemplating in the body its nature of vanishing, or he dwells contemplating in the body its nature of both arising and vanishing. Or else mindfulness that there is a body is simply established in him to the extent necessary for bare knowledge and repeated mindfulness. And he dwells independent, not clinging on anything in the world. That is how anyone dwells contemplating the body in the body. The mindfulness breathing can be summarized in steps by step as follows. Step 1. When breathing in long, he knows, I am breathing in long. When breathing out long, he knows, I am breathing out long. Step 2. When breathing in short, he knows, I am breathing in short. When breathing out short, he knows, I am breathing out short. Step 3. He trains thus. Experiencing the entire body, I shall breathe in. He trains thus. Experiencing the entire body, I shall breathe out. Step 4. He trains thus. Calming the bodily formation, body relaxation, I shall breathe in. He trains thus. Calming the bodily formation, body relaxation, I shall breathe out.
It should be noticed that steps 1 and 2 of mindfulness breathing provide a foundation of mindfulness initialization, that is, when breathing in, then having a consciousness and having a mindfulness aware of the instance of breathing in, and when breathing out, then having a consciousness and having a mindfulness aware of the instance of breathing out. And by determining on how long the breathing is, then we know if the breathing is either long or short as well. The practice of mindfulness breathing is not about forcibly the breathing making it in or out, and not about making it long or short. The mindfulness breathing is about having a mindfulness as a sensing the breathing if it is in or out, and if it is long or short. By practicing like this for a while, we can constantly have a mindfulness at all times when breathing. and the mindfulness will lead to dominate the breathing, becoming a faculty of mindfulness which will empower the mind to be in a meditation, and this is indirectly a practice of mindfulness meditation as well. In the walking up and down with mindfulness, we are practicing on initiating mindfulness when walking, and technically speaking we practice on having mindfulness on an object of consciousness when a foot touching the ground. While in the mindfulness with body postures and body movements, and technically speaking we practice on having mindfulness on an object of consciousness on the body and its movements. We extend the practice by making mindfulness when having all kinds of body postures and body movements in daily activities, and especially in mindfulness breathing we practice on initiating mindfulness even in a non-moving posture like sitting or standing, or even in sleeping by having mindfulness on an object of consciousness on breathing. In the practice of mindfulness initialization and development, we utilize the movement of body, and when having a contact, then having a consciousness, and then inducing a sense of awareness of what is happening. This is an arising of mindfulness with having a consciousness. In this practice the Buddha suggested to utilize a rhythm of walking in mindfulness walking, and a rhythm of breathing in mindfulness breathing as a way to practice. That is, any time when having a consciousness, then immediately having a mindfulness right away. In practicing the mindfulness initialization, we will learn how to initialize a mindfulness when making a body movement activity such as a breathing when performing a mindfulness breathing. After being able to initialize a mindfulness, the next step is to learn on how to apply the mindfulness to detect an arising emotional state of mind, and then abandoning that unwholesome state of mind. In the Buddhist learning process on the truths of life within nature, we must start with having a mindfulness to be aware of what is happening within the mind first, then by having a mindfulness with careful attention or yoniso manasikara is very useful in detecting whether the mind is wholesomeness or unwholesomeness. From morality concerned, we are dealing with the matters of what is right or wrong. It is a social norm that determines on our actions of what we can do, and what we cannot do. We do something because it will be praised from the public, and we do not do something because it will be blamed from the public. However, when dealing with the mind, it is not only a matter defined by public norm, but we are dealing with something called wholesomeness, or unwholesomeness, which can be broadly defined as follows. The wholesomeness will usually make the mind become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated, while on the contrary, the unwholesomeness would drive the mind with desire and lust, restless, and ending up with suffering in life. The Buddha emphasized on the importance of keeping the mind in wholesome state of mind, while if there is any arising unwholesomeness within the mind, then we should immediately abandon it as follows.
I teach you to abandon any kind of arising unwholesomeness within the mind, because the mind with unwholesomeness will be struggling, non-steadied internally, restless with desire and lust. This can be done by having mindfulness with careful attention on something wholesome, in order to abandon that unwholesomeness, so that the mind will become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated in peace. This is the way to have the mind be wholesome.
The fundamental difference between the wholesomeness and unwholesomeness is that when the mind with unwholesomeness, then the mind will become struggling, non-steadied internally, restless with desire and lust, while when the mind with wholesomeness, then the mind will become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated in peace. Fundamentally, when the mind receiving stimulus from the world, after the feeling, then arising the craving for sensual pleasure and the craving for extermination, these craving will drive the mind for desire and lust, while the craving for existence will delude the mind to be involved with all matters with desire and lust. Because of this reason, any arising craving in the mind is unwholesomeness that drives the mind to be struggling with greed, hatred, and delusion. The craving is considered as the root cause of all kinds of defilements. The Buddha compared that this craving was a burning matter leading problems to life, and we should abandon this arising unwholesomeness by having a mindfulness with careful attention on something wholesome to keep the mind to be steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated throughout the Buddhist practice. The mindfulness and the meditation are supporting factors to maintain the mind in wholesomeness. Learning the Buddhist meditation is a very critical practice on how to manage the mind to abandon an unwholesomeness and to maintain the mind in wholesome condition. The Buddha suggested that after being able to initialize a mindfulness, then the mindfulness can be applied to protect the mind in the following steps.
We should have mindfulness to protect the mind as follows. 1. When having a consciousness, no matter what kinds of a mental phenomenon is arising, then having a mindfulness to consider it thoughtfully with systematic attention, yoniso manasikara, to determine whether it is wholesomeness or unwholesomeness. 2. When having a consciousness receiving a stimulus, external object of consciousness, through the six sense bases, then having a mindfulness to contain the stimulus, not to be involved with. 3. Even when eating food, also must have a mindfulness to control on the consumption. 4. In case of encountering with an unwholesomeness within the mind, then, having a mindfulness to abandon it. 5. In case of encountering with an unwholesomeness within the mind, then having a mindfulness to abstain from desire and lust. 6. In case of encountering with a strong unwholesomeness which is difficult to abandon right away, then having a mindfulness to alleviate it, and then abandon it later. 7. Finally, to follow the Buddha's teachings in performing the Buddhist practice in order to develop insight wisdom for the cessation of all defilements, then use the wisdom to abandon the problem and to liberate the mind.
The application of mindfulness starts with having a mindfulness with careful attention to be aware of the state of mind whether it is wholesome or unwholesome. And then we will practice on having a mindfulness with careful attention to handle any arising unwholesome phenomenon within the mind properly, starting from trying to avoid any troubling stimulus that arrives into the mind through six sense bases. If possible, we have to contain it, and if it is unavoidable, then we have to abstain it, not to be too excited or to be involved with the world. Even when eating daily food, we also have to contain the consumption, not to eat too much food. And sometimes, we have to learn how to lessen or to alleviate the problem so that we can abandon the problem without difficulty. During performing the Buddhist practice there will be various unwholesome thoughts disturbing the mind, and it is a necessity to always have a developed mindfulness at all times in order to handle of all kinds of arising troubling phenomena and thoughts during the Buddhist practice as follows.
When starting a practice, and if we let the mind randomly roll on in exploration, mostly the mind will be disturbed by the 16 various kinds of unwholesome thoughts, mental defilements, including greed, ill will, anger, grudge, detraction, domineering, envy, meanness, deceit, hypocrisy, obstinacy, competing contention, conceit, contempt, vanity, and negligence. Therefore, we should learn on how to abandon all of these unwholesome thoughts with appropriated wholesome ways. Typically, in order to abandon all of those unwholesome thoughts, and to keep the mind in concentration, we must have a mindfulness with careful attention and determining on the wholesomeness of the Buddha's words such as to take the Buddha, the Dharma, and the noble Buddhist monks as refuge. Then the mind will become cheerful, raptured, in tranquility, relaxed, and steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. The Buddha's teachings are considered as wholesome teachings explaining on how to abandon any unwholesome thoughts in the mind, which can be compared like a way to open a closed vessel, to light up a darkened mind for an enlightenment.
The practice in Buddhism, once the mind is able to be aware of the arising mental phenomenon, and then determining whether the mental phenomenon is wholesome or unwholesome, and then we will be able to manage the particular mental phenomenon properly by abandoning the unwholesomeness and keeping the mind to be wholesome. By then the mind will become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. This leads the mind to progress to the next stage of Buddhist practice in the mindfulness meditation, a very special way of practice on the meditation with mindfulness, by which it is a significant milestone of the Buddhist practice to elevate the quality of mindfulness, so that later the mindfulness will be empowered to be able to perform an insight observation on the mind. Before the Buddha time, no one discover on using the mindfulness to see what is happening inside the mind. Most people perform the meditation without a mindfulness for supernatural power. In principle, there was no one made a study on searching the truths of life through the observation practicing with mindfulness before. The Buddhism is about learning the truths of life through an insight observation, therefore, the mindfulness development is the very critical practice in Buddhism. The Buddha was the first one who introduced the practice of mindfulness in studying on the truths of life within nature. Before the Buddha time, people only knew the practice on meditation, but after the Buddha enlightenment the Buddha started to teach on how to use the mindfulness in insight observation, and performing research on Dharma to investigate and to analyze for the truths of life within nature. However, in order to be able to perform an insight observation, the mindfulness must be improved in terms of quality by performing a special meditation, so-called the mindfulness meditation. The Buddha enlightenment was incidentally a major systematic breakthrough introspective learning in understanding the life and nature happening in the world. The Buddhist solution to the aggravation of defilement in threefold strategy is by performing the practice, then having a mindfulness to manage all kinds of defilements that are aggravated in many rounds of the process of dependent origination. Since a defilement within the mind processing starts from the finest defilement to an initial thought, then aggravating to a middle defilement, and eventually becoming a rough defilement, respectively. The Buddha solution strategy to manage these arising problems by applying the threefold study strategy. The mindfulness will be applied to manage all kinds of unwholesomeness throughout the Buddhist practice, starting from the rough defilements. Then by performing a mindfulness meditation the empowered mindfulness will cleanse all the middle defilements, and then dwelling into the course of thinking by tracing into the initial thought in a mindfulness absorption, the mindfulness will abandon an arising unwholesome initial though by liberated thinking, so that a purified mindfulness is developed for the use of performing an insight observation. The practice of insight observation will reveal the truths of life within nature, and realizing that a life is a natural process which is no self, then the mind is liberated from the object of consciousness. Thus, the mindfulness will incorporate the gaining insight for the cessation of all finest defilements in the mind. And typically, the tasks in Buddhist practice can be outlined as a comprehensive system of having the mindfulness of various developments to be able to abandon all kinds of defilements step by step within the mind, processing from the outmost to the origin of defilement in the inner mind. In order to accomplish these tasks, the mindfulness has to be strengthened up by performing a Buddhist meditation.